So you're about to enter the PC free zone. If you can't stomach fearless questions or authentic answers, then I suggest you switch off your monitors now. Otherwise, buckle up, because we've got one heck of a segment coming up. As the fastest growing religion in Europe, Islam has the region divided, but will it see the region destroyed? Let's take a look at the bullet points. Over 1 million migrants have poured into Europe this year. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said this week that she wants to, quote, drastically decrease the number of refugees coming into her country, a clear compromise on her forced integration open door policy. Meantime, Sharia courts already exist and are operating in nations like Britain, France, Holland, and Austria, all as reports of Muslim no-go zones are on the rise across Europe. As 30% of Brits say they support Muslim immigration ban, is it any wonder we've seen a surge in the far right? And what are the consequences to liberty and the European way of life? Joining us now is Paul Joseph Watson. Paul, you were just in Brussels, where you were essentially chased out of certain areas. You were also accosted in Paris. And yet we're being told by the likes of people like your own mayor, Boris Johnson, that Muslim no-go zones are legend, fiction, and that these migrants, well, all they want is a safe haven. What is your view on the current reality facing Europe?
Well, the reality is, Faith, that you don't have to go to, quote, right-wing talking points to see the truth here. ISIS's own manifesto, released a couple of weeks ago, says that they will exploit the refugee crisis to infiltrate jihadists. We had this warning months ago, but now again it was in their own manifesto that they would infiltrate Europe, create these Muslim no-go ghettos, and use them as centres of radicalised power. So as you mentioned, we went to Molenbeek in Brussels just a few days basically after the Paris massacre. We went there in the daytime as night fell. We ended up being chased out of there. First, we were denied service at a restaurant because we weren't Muslim. Then we were actually chased out of there. We were followed by cars. Again, no police in sight, despite the fact it was the day after the raids on the Paris terror suspects in that very town. So this claim that Muslim no-go areas don't exist, or, you know, they're a conspiracy theory invented by the right wing, is a complete misnomer, as you saw with the whole Trump controversy in the UK. The mayor of London, Boris Johnson, came out and said, I'll walk around with Trump, no problem. There are no Muslim no-go areas in London. Of course, if he does that, he's going to be surrounded by 20 news cameras and a phalanx of police officers. The actual British police came out the day after and said, that's complete nonsense. There are Muslim no-go areas across the United Kingdom. We don't go there because we're attacked. So that narrative was immediately destroyed. These no-go areas exist. ISIS has expressed an intention to create more of them. And that's a big threat because Molenbeek is the jihadist capital of Europe. That's where all these terrorists came out of. Most of the Paris massacre suspects came out of there. So this is a genuine problem, and we can't hide behind political correctness and pretend that it doesn't exist.
Well, there seems to be really two strains, those that are still hiding behind that veil. And the mainstream media is frankly now being forced to report so many of these stories, including the no-go zones. And I just want to share a few points with our viewers at home, a bit of an update on these new migrant meccas, places like Sweden and Germany. Sweden today, it came out that homosexuals are now being accosted on the streets by these Muslim migrants, snakes being hung around their neck. Also, disturbing reports that things are being posted in people's letterboxes across Sweden saying basically convert or be beheaded. Germany, we've seen towns of 3,000 have 2,500 men of military age be imported in there. And of course, there's a UK story out of Rotherham, one of the most famous, where 1,400 girls in this small town became victims of rape jihadists. Paul, I want to ask you, what is the role, as we here in Canada we've already begun our massive migration of these economic migrants, frankly, into our country. What is the role of the state in importing this jihad creep?
Well, I mean, people have asked, why would they import huge numbers of people if it's going to cause, you know, social upheaval, which it inevitably will? What benefit does it have for the state? Well, first of all, these people are going to be dependent on government. They're going to have children who become citizens who vote for more government. So if you've got a big government that wants to expand its power, then obviously it's in their interest to import this huge voting block of people. Secondly, and this has just come out in the past couple of days, The EU, which of course has completely failed on this policy, it's an absolute disaster. You have migrants queuing up at the border trying to get in. It's complete chaos. Now they've doubled down and said they're going to introduce a paramilitary force that will be able to operate on EU borders without the consent of national governments. So completely violating national sovereignty. They're talking about 2,500 armed guards, naval patrols, drones. Again, even if the individual nation state says we don't want this force on our border, the EU is crafting a plan right now to do so. So they're using their own failed policy. They rolled out the red carpet in the first place. It's now a complete disaster. But instead of handing the power back to national governments to control their own borders, they're now saying, give us more power, because of course it furthers their interest, which is the expansion of the EU federal superstate and the evisceration of national sovereignty. So those are just two angles from which states have benefited from this migrant crisis, which their own policies created.
Now, I don't think you necessarily have to be fearful of a powerful state. I think that these sorts of notions of liberty and sovereignty are, frankly, on the hearts of just about every single citizen of the Western world. And yet, when it comes to this jihad creep, they have found these bizarre bedfellows, frankly, in the left. I've just returned from Prague and Nuremberg, two very, very different places when it comes to this particular issue. And I met one gentleman, if I can share an anecdote with you, in Nuremberg, and he said, look, I have no problem with the migrants so long as they adopt our way of life. And then I brought up the issue of the niqab, a debate we've had here within just north of the 49th. And he's like, well, yeah, it is sort of antisocial behavior. Maybe we shouldn't do it. And so when you kind of press on it, all of a sudden folks kind of see the light of day and say, yeah, this isn't really what we want in our culture. Couple that with the fact our own prime minister had issues labeling female genital mutilation and so-called honor killings barbaric practices. Talk to me a little bit about this bizarre marriage between the left and, frankly, pushers of jihad creep. And do you sense that there will be a nasty divorce in its future?
Well, we're already seeing a split within some elements of the left who are now calling other liberals, as they claim they are, the regressive left, because they're adopting these politically correct principles which disguise the fact that the religion of Islam, and I know this is, politically incorrect to say, is not tolerant and it's not compatible with Western liberal values, which is why now in Germany, Sweden, Finland, and all these countries, as you alluded to, they're having a huge rape epidemic as a result of bringing these migrants in. The initial victims of that are other Muslim women within these refugee camps. But now also we've had numerous cases in Germany where women living in the local areas are being attacked, sexually abused by these migrants. And what's worse is that the state is covering it up, again, in alliance with left-wingers who ignore this kind of problem. So in Germany, the authorities are not divulging the details of these rape cases, so as in their own words, not to legitimize critics of mass migration. They're going after Germans who make, quote, anti-migrant Facebook posts, enlisting ex-Stasi officials to do so. And of course, this is all justified by the left because they're afraid of criticizing a minority, despite the fact that, frankly, some cultures are better than others. And feminists whine all day about a college rape culture that doesn't exist, has been statistically debunked, while we're actually importing a real rape culture, because you can look at the polls in these countries where these migrants are coming from. And again, 4/5 of them are not from Syria. They're coming from these other countries. You go to the polls in those countries, the vast majority of those people support Sharia law. They support beheading gay people. They support stoning women to death. So we're bringing in an intolerant, real rape culture, and feminists won't talk about it because, again, it would mean criticizing a minority, and that's anathema to them because they're complete hypocrites.
And I'm happy you brought up all of these points, because when we talk about the rape culture of the Middle East, I'd like to remind our viewers that I believe it's 14 times within the Quran that believers are actually encouraged to take on kuffars or infidels as sexual slaves. So that is actually an ingrained rape culture right there, never mind what we see in the likes of our university campuses here in the Western world. Okay, on the topic topic of free speech and this PC culture, my friend Majid Nawaz, he's got a great book, by the way, Radical, if anyone's looking for last-minute Christmas gifts, really fantastic read. He had a great piece this past week in the Daily Beast where he talked about the difference between scrutinizing Islam, which really is a right to any sort of thoughtful academia, and discriminating against individual Muslims. And I want to be clear on this program, what we're doing is the former, not the latter. I want to be able to say, hey, you know what? Muhammad had a 6-year-old wife named Aisha. Yeah, sure, he waited till she was 9 in order to consummate. But in my culture, frankly, the better culture, that's called pedophilia. But when I say that, Paul, I'm called Islamophobic. I'm called a racist, even though Islam is not a race. I'm called every sort of nasty, bigoted name. What is the effect? What is the cost on our future as a society if we cannot exercise our right to free speech on this very issue?
Well, it's the complete evisceration of the right to criticize a religion. That's all it comes down to. And I was actually reported to the police for making some of the same points that you just made. I made a YouTube video basically saying stoning rape victims to death is bad. Executing homosexuals is bad. Killing people who leave the faith of Islam is bad. Somebody reported me to the British police for doing that. And then again, you mentioned the regressive left and the Majid Nawaz article. They actually listed a devout Muslim American who campaigns against honor killings as an anti-Muslim bigot. So they created this huge list of Islamophobes, and some of them were actually quite devout Muslims who were simply campaigning against things like, FGM, female genital mutilation, and honor killings. So the left has gone completely insane, but in their zeal to virtue signal and prove that they're more progressive than anyone else, they actually expose the fact that they're more regressive than ever before in tolerating what is a completely intolerant religion, which is in need of reform, just as Christianity was reformed back in the 1500s. And we should have the right to say that stoning women to death is bad without being reported to the police for a, quote, hate crime. If that ever becomes the norm, then, we're basically going to have more of these Muslim ghettos, more of this ideology, which is very oppressive and very illiberal, which is why we need more liberals to grow a pair and speak out against it.
And I think that, frankly, there are more liberals growing pairs across the world. But what I'm wondering about is, are they finding their answers in the right or wrong places? And what I mean here is that there seems to be a growing intolerance of political correctness. Couple that with the fact that there is, soft target terrorism on the rise across the world on 3 different continents. And what you see is a rise and success of many political parties that are labeled far right, like Greece's Golden Dawn, the Northern League in Italy, of course, the National Front in France recently, UKIP, by the way, which I think is totally mainstream now, and Donald Trump with the whole, Muslim thing in his remarks. What do you predict will be the future of these so-called far-right parties going into 2016?
Well, they're going to be very successful for one, but that's because there's been such a vacuum, because there are no actual liberals or very few to criticize the intolerant religion of Islam. So in that vacuum, that emboldens actual neo-Nazis and extremists, and their voices are actually amplified because there's no one else in that environment to talk about these kind of issues. So in ignoring these issues due to political correctness, the regressive left has actually made the voices of neo-Nazis and actual extremists more prominent, because people don't have anywhere else to go for an alternating narrative to what we're hearing in the mainstream media, especially about this refugee crisis. So it's only going to have the effect of emboldening right-wing extremists. As many top security experts in Europe have said, you're going to see more riots. There was one last night in the Netherlands. You're going to see more civil unrest between, Islamists in Europe who have created these ghettos and actual right-wing violent extremists, because there are no real or very few moderate voices to speak out against this. So that's all I'm trying to do in lending my voice to highlighting these issues.
Final question. As we begin to bridge the gap between us and Europe here in North America to import these migrants, do you have a message for us here in Canada and our friends in the States?
Well, in the States, of course, it emerged today that they've already let in 100,000 Syrian refugees since 2012. You look at the polls, 21% of Syrians support ISIS. So I think the policy that you have in Canada, which I believe is still in place, where they've limited the refugee intake to only women, children and families, so unaccompanied men are not allowed into the country. I don't know whether that's still the case, but that was the situation the last I heard. I mean, that is a sensible policy. But obviously, you need to take the risk of being labeled an Islamophobe and a racist, even though Islam isn't a race, because you're importing a culture that is very illiberal, that is anti-free speech, which in many cases poses a direct security threat to your family going forward. And it's not just about jihadists. It's about those Sharia courts that are in the United Kingdom. It's about this mentality that's completely intolerant, that treats women as second-class citizens. That is going to lower the standard of living. It's going to create more of these ghettos in major Canadian and American cities. So that's why you need to have the courage to stand up for truly classical liberal principles and speak out against this insane migrant wave, because it's become an invasion. They're now trying to walk it back. Now it's proven to be a disaster, as we predicted. But people need to stand up for true liberal principles and get past their fear of being politically incorrect.
Paul, I want to thank you for standing up, for taking the risk of being called every name under the sun, because frankly, the stakes are too high. Folks, that's Paul Joseph Watson. You can find him on Twitter @PrisonPlanet.